Welcome back to Velshi and Rule. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi tells NBC News, quote, later today, I will make an announcement after I meet with my chairman, my leadership, and my caucus. The meeting is expected for 4 o'clock, but we might expect a statement from her at 2 o'clock Eastern. The number of lawmakers calling for impeachment has jumped dramatically in the last few days, in part because there is a lot in the reporting on President Trump withholding military aid for Ukraine that begins to look impeachable. The Washington Post is reporting that, quote, officials at the Office of Management and Budget relayed Trump's order to the State Department and the Pentagon. They explained that the president had concerns and wanted to analyze whether the money needed to be spent.
The Post also reports that, quote, administration officials were instructed to tell lawmakers that the delays were part of an interagency process, but to give them no additional information. There's a lot we still don't know about this story, although the Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times have since confirmed a number of aspects of the story. But the reporting seems to indicate that the president's acting chief of staff directed the OMB to withhold funding while concealing the reason why, both from other federal agencies and from Congress.
And then there is this, the mystery of Rudy Giuliani, who is Trump's personal lawyer. He's not the White House counsel. He does not work for the President of the United States. He is not employed by the taxpayers or the government of the United States. He met with an advisor to the Ukrainian president to ask them to investigate Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. Giuliani defended himself on Hannity, claiming that he was sent by the State Department.
Did our State Department ask you to go on a mission for them?
They did. I was called
you were
by
a good
the
citizen, and you went.
The State Department called me and said, would I take a call from Mr. Yermak, who's number 2 or 3 to the president-elect, now the president. I was put together with Mr. Yermak. I talked to him. He gave me enormously important facts. I conveyed them all to the State Department. Unlike the media lies, fake news, I wasn't operating on my own. I was operating at the request of the State Department.
Joining us now, the Executive Director for Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics and former federal corruption prosecutor, Noah Bookbinder. I got to start with Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani telling Sean Hannity he was there because the State Department asked him to go to Ukraine. Help us understand this. The White House counsel is Pat Cipollone. There have to be dozens of lawyers who are part of this administration.
Or employees of the State Department.
Or employees of the State Department. Why on earth would the president's, one of his personal attorneys and television surrogates be someone doing any sort of official business for the U.S. government?
I don't have a good answer for that. And I think to begin with, first of all, we don't know whether what Rudy Giuliani said is true or not. But if it is, it sure raises a whole lot more questions than it answers. There's the suggestion, if this is true, that not only is the president abusing his power, his presidential power, to try to influence a foreign government to help him in his reelection and to go after his political opponents, but agencies like the State Department are part of that effort too. So that's a problem. But the fact that he's using his private attorney, if true, also suggests steps to prevent this from being discovered, to go around regular processes, which seems to suggest kind of a consciousness of guilt as well. But the whole thing's really strange, and I don't quite know what to make of it.
Yes, join the party on this one. The Washington Post has been reporting that it seems like Mick Mulvaney, who was the president's chief of staff, some might call that a job of a gatekeeper, or the person who's supposed to stop the president from getting into trouble, might have misled lawmakers about why this funding was withheld, which goes into a lot of places, right? This is congressionally approved funding. Congress deserves a real explanation. Tell me about this, the legality of this. Does that sort of spread this into more than just Donald Trump doing something? The fact that he has now got the State Department possibly involved and Mick Mulvaney as chief of staff involved?
Well, I think it goes to the central question of abuse of power, that you have the president using his position to advance his own reelection, to go after his political enemies, if he is in fact using all of the levers of government, using his White House staff, using federal agencies to advance this effort to get himself reelected and to hide what he's doing from anyone who could have some kind of oversight against him, that makes it significantly worse from where it already was, which was pretty bad.
Okay, but what does worse mean? If all of the above were true, is worse still it gets us closer to impeachment? Impeachment being a purely or at least very political process. What, if any, are the actual legal ramifications or consequences for this kind of conduct?
Sure. Well, impeachment demands high crimes and misdemeanors, which is actually not, it's not a criminal standard. There don't have to be crimes, although there certainly can be. And it should be a high standard. It shouldn't be something that anybody goes into casually. We concluded this summer that we had reached the point between the obstruction of justice that Special Counsel Mueller exposed and the rampant corruption through the president's violations of the emoluments clauses of the Constitution, his likely participation in campaign finance violations, that all of that rose to that level where impeachment was appropriate. This seems to be more brazen, more current, and yet another reason to go forward. So I think, on the merits, we're there. Congress needs to take aggressive action. We've started to see movements in that direction, and I hope that they will follow through.
Noah, the administration, when there have been previous attempts at investigations, including an impeachment inquiry, has exerted executive privilege over some people who one wonders why they would have it, like Corey Lewandowski. But in this case, we are actually talking about people who might have it. How has this hampered your efforts until now, and how do you see it playing into any attempt to get to the bottom of what actually happened here?
Well, this president has, in really unprecedented ways, sought to prevent any kind of oversight of his conduct. So he's tried to stop witnesses from testifying before Congress who worked for the White House, worked for agencies, or didn't, as is in the case of Corey Lewandowski. He's gone to court to prevent Congress or states from getting his tax returns. He has fought lawsuits which seek information about his business practices as they bear on the emoluments clause potential emoluments clause violations. So he has sought to stop anybody from getting the information they need to do legitimate oversight. I think one of the things, though, that's different about this current crisis is that the president has actually essentially admitted to a lot of the really problematic conduct. We don't yet know if there was a quid pro quo, but abusing his office, abusing the presidency to try to pressure a foreign leader to go after a political opponent, that seems like it should be enough for action, even if we are never able to prove that other piece. So I do think that unquestionably this administration will try to prevent oversight and prevent information from coming out. But we already know so much here, as we now do with a lot of those earlier problems as well.
Okay, we know so much, and the president would continue to say, it's a witch hunt, you're all just coming after me. I want to show on our screen, in the last few moments, we've gotten an update. We're now up to, I believe it's 165, is that correct?
165.
165 House Democrats that are supporting impeachment action out of a total of 235. We will hear from Speaker Nancy Pelosi in about an hour.
Yeah, that number was 15 lower, maybe even 20 lower yesterday. I mean, this is moving quickly.
If, in fact, we reach a point where Nancy Pelosi says it's go time, what does that look like? What specifically changes?
Well, I think that one of the things that happens is this investigation, which is already happening in the House Judiciary Committee, whether it stays in that committee or is in some kind of select committee, it erases any ambiguity as to what the purpose of it is, so that everybody involved will be very clear about the fact that this is an inquiry to see whether impeachment is appropriate. That will help the American people to understand what's going on. It will, I believe, be helpful in the courts, although I think the House Judiciary Committee has already taken really good steps in that direction, which will help them in the courts. And then hopefully it will also mean that it will move quickly. It will move with full support from leadership, which will get answers as quickly as we can and a decision quickly as to whether to move forward with impeachment or not.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.